My name's Eugene McGahan. As Rochelle said, I work there was some work for a company called Integrity Ag and Environment at Highfields, which are contracted to deliver this project, and another project that sort of led into it, which I'll touch on a bit today as well. I'll sort of fill you in on how we've got to where we are with it, and then what the process is at the moment that we're currently working on, and when we hope to have these things finally delivered. A bit of a background, as I said, there was a previous project where we sort of wandered all around the country to each state and talked to people, and we reviewed some other information. So we sort of looked as part of this project at planning frameworks and identified issues with potential solutions for the development of new and expanding farms, because it was highlighted to us there was an issue with that, and certainly when we went around and talked to people, it was found it an issue, particularly in certain areas and in certain states. From that project, there was pretty widespread support for a national guideline of some description for meat chicken farms in order to address some of the lack of information and really to support that application and the assessment and approvals process for meat chicken farms. So that's a bit of a background how we sort of got to this project. So the objectives with this one were, there was a few of them. There was because we had two different projects here, essentially sort of projects or sub-projects. One of the big issues that was identified was particularly around odour. So we wanted to develop an agreed set of principles for odour and dust impact assessment. So that was what we call sub-project one. And then the idea to start was to develop a national environmental guideline for the establishment of meat chicken farms, and also develop environmental guideline, basically guidelines around the environmental management of meat chicken farms. So that was what our original idea was, but we'll fill you in a little bit later on how that sort of changed a little bit. So just to start with, we'll focus on sub-project one. So this is the one about addressing these odour issues. So in order to do that, our idea was to establish like what we call a specialist technical group. So we had a technical forum with basically getting all the key air quality specialists around the country together, and we put them together and we call that our Odour working group. We also want to develop a series of what we call issues analysis chapters by members from that group, and once we had those chapters together, to develop peer-reviewed publication, all publications. We haven't quite decided. We might be able to get more than one out of that outlines the agreed approach developed by that forum from the Odour working group. And from that, develop guidelines for odour and dust impact assessment, basically so we can include them into the broader planning and environmental guidelines. So the two documents out of sub-project 2 were the design, construction and planning approval process, and the second one was to focus on operational type matters. So the draft guidelines developed uses sort of best guidance in use throughout the country, with gaps addressed with the sort of latest science available, particularly research and stuff, scientific stuff that's come out from agri-futures projects. The Odour guidance one, as I said, was to be incorporated into the main project. So just with the environmental guidelines themselves, we also put together another group with that called our technical reference group, to provide feedback and expert guidance on any issues that we might have. So the idea is to develop a draft guideline, get that to them, and get these people together and thrash out what the issues still are. And also additional stakeholder consultation to be undertaken, which I'll talk a little bit about how that's going at the moment. So the Odour working group brief was simply to improve the scientific consensus on odour impact assessment with respect to the meat chicken farms. So why this was important? Any of you people who had to deal with trying to get new farm developments in places that are a bit contentious, it's a fairly complex and expensive component of the approvals process, and usually the stumbling block there. It's a key driver for complaints, objections to developments, and essentially when you end up in court and appeals process, it's usually odour they're arguing about. So obviously we wanted a fair bit of focus on this. So some of the stuff that come out of that earlier project is like the regulators were saying that due to the uncertainty involved with odour impact assessment, they were reluctant to grant approvals even when impacts are within acceptable limits. So they wanted, like, you know, more buffers and stuff put in place to basically deal with what they call their margin of error. Means that decisions could be appealed or contested, which results obviously in additional costs and time delays, which also adds additional costs. Also, minimising uncertainty associated with the process would provide benefits to all the stakeholder groups involved, increase the ease of assessments, increase certainty of the results so people have more confidence in them, and then reduce that contestability, which is, yeah, hopefully try and reduce the amount of these that end up in court. This is a bit of a summary of some of the stakeholder consultation on the Odour working group, so the issues that they had to deal with there. I won't go into in great detail. I've sort of mentioned a few of those already. But yeah, some of them around particularly because we wanted to get a document together, some of the lack of guidance regarding acceptable Odour models and the inputs to those models, how we deal with like site-specific stuff, how regulators sometimes want the worst case scenarios modelled, whereas that really isn't how a poultry farm operates with the maximum bird capacity. Some operational factors sort of can't be taken into account. And probably this is quite a big one, which we spent a fair bit of time on, is there's, to be able to do some of this odour impact assessment with modelling, you need some input data, so odour emissions files. And so that odour data, you know, a lot of that was coming from older farms, and so it wasn't really reflective of what some of these newer sheds and stuff were showing out of it. So yeah, to be able to get some of that newer data in there as part of the assessment process. So they're probably some of the main things as the Odour working group that we had to deal with there. So as I said, the Odour working group is to approve scientific consensus around some key parameters, estimating odour emissions, how you modelled those odour emissions and how they disperse, determining the impacts at the other end. So yeah, basically at the sensitive receptor. So how we actually judge that someone's been affected by the odour. And also on the side, yeah, there's been a bit of issue around dust emissions. They're not as bad, or don't tend to be such a problem when we're trying to get new DAs up with farms. It's usually odour, but certainly dust sometimes causes issues. So we wanted to include that in there. So we had a technical forum, basically, where we got all those odour specialists together for a day, presented on the current practices, issues and best practices. So basically picked the people, we made sure we had a select group of people that had expertise in certain areas. So basically got them to present on that. Thrashed that out basically at the meeting. Obviously we didn't get everything resolved, but yeah, it certainly helped going a long way to resolving a whole bunch of things. Remember, the people we put together in the room here, a lot of them are the ones that sit opposite each other in court and argue stuff out. So obviously there was some fairly robust discussion during the day on that and how we deal with that. But surprisingly, there was a lot of consensus on stuff. So the idea was to advance the degree of consensus around those issues that sort of contestable. So the Odour working group tasks and outputs. So as I said, a set of issues analysis chapters put together. So that was essentially one document. So a large document that basically we got each of those participants, or a few participants, depending on how much expertise they had, to write those individual chapters. Got a draft paper together, potentially, as I said, potentially more of those to be put in a peer-reviewed journal. And obviously coming out of those things is to get those technical chapters incorporated into what is the odour assessment guideline for meat chicken farms. So then we wanted to take, those technical chapters and put it in a guideline for people basically to follow, particularly if they have to do odour modelling, how you actually go about that. So that's just a bit of example. So that this is just the title of some of the stuff we've circulated and stuff now. So this is this best practice guideline that I talked around. We've put together one paper now with 11 different authors on it from that group that we're currently working on to upgrade. And there was a bit of extra work come out of this, because what we identified is when we sort of take all that best science and put it together and follow all what the rules and stuff be, it didn't make a heck of a lot of sense to what we actually see in reality. So there's been a fair bit of sort of complex work. I won't go into detail and looking at how the impacts of odour and particularly how odour disperses from sheds, given that a lot of the models and stuff that are used to do odour dispersion modelling weren't necessarily developed, or they weren't developed for chicken sheds. They were particularly developed for stacks and that sort of thing. So there was a whole bunch of this sort of advanced modelling and stuff that was done, and a report come out of that. And we developed up some case studies of different farms to basically try and resolve some of those answers. So that's one of the things that probably has held the project up for about 6 months, to do that additional bit of work. So these are these technical chapters. I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but yeah, so this is what the Odour working group basically put together. So obviously a very important one is odour emission and ventilation rates. So that's to get your odour emission profile out of a shed. Certainly a particular one on dust emissions, that we had to sort some stuff out there, which we've moved forward on that. Obviously when you've got that input, the inputs to the model, there's actually the models you use and then the settings in your models. So how you actually drive these models. So a whole bunch of material in there. So we've dedicated a chapter to that. And then after you've actually run the models and stuff, you've got to look at odour nuisance and assessing impact. So that's obviously another important field as well. So that makes up another chapter. And we've also developed up what we call an S-factor formula for separation distance. So it's a simplified method where you don't have to go into modelling to look at the separation distance for farms. It's pretty commonly used already in some states for meat chicken farms, but also used in the pig and poultry industry and stuff as well. So where you basically put a whole bunch of what we call these S factors in, to do with whether it's surface roughness or topography between the farm and the sensitive receptor, to calculate a separation distance without going into expensive and detailed odour modelling. So out of that, as I said, we developed up a best practice guide, particularly around this issue of odour modelling. So yeah, it's about 20 odd pages, that document. So what emissions you should be using, how do you generate an emission file, what model you should use when you're actually using met data, whether you've got real data or whether you've got to develop data from a model, on how you actually go about doing that. And then when you go through the model, essentially this is around, chapter 6 is around all the settings you use, and then the assessment impact criteria. And then also it's about, well, if you've done some modelling, what basically to report in the model, so it's transparent to what you've done, so so everyone can see actually how the model's done, so what information should be in there. So that's basically the audit side of things. So now, as I said, we put together a technical reference group to actually develop the main guidelines themselves. Had specific goals. So our idea was, we developed up some draft guidelines. We sent it out to 20 or 30 select people, invited them to come to a meeting in Sydney last year. So the idea, their goals was to identify the areas where there was insufficient information to support applicants and decision makers, provide feedback regarding the suitability of the approach we used, and identify any additional research conducted, which was, as I pointed out before, one of those things was around this issue around odour, and does it actually match reality, what's happening on farms. As I said, we held a workshop in Sydney over 2 days with a whole bunch of people, ag extension people, industry people, ag policy officers, regulators from EPAs, local government people, consultants, basically discussed the feedback on the document. So we collated all the feedback that we had on them, took it to the meeting, and highlighted the ones that were most contentious, so we could thrash it out at the meeting. So the key things around, like the structure of the documents, the scope of them, the approach to state-specific requirements, because one of the challenges of developing a national guideline is you've got dealing with a whole bunch of states with all different rules and regulations that you have to somehow incorporate into a national guideline. So the original draft guidelines, we had planning and development guidelines, as I said, and environmental management. So probably the big thing they were developed from is that a whole bunch of documents exist in other states, like there's a broiler code in Victoria, and Queensland has a guideline. All these things are either different ages or say different things, or some of them are getting out of date. So yeah, but they still have useful information in it, and obviously have a regulatory process that can be quite applicable to each state in there. But we also wanted to review the state planning and environmental legislation to make sure it's up to date, particularly look at guidelines from other states, because national guidelines have operated in the beef feedlot industry for 20 odd years and stuff, and that they are widely used around Australia now. So how they go about their task. Environmental management guidance and other reference material included in these documents. So our principles of guiding what would be included in there, whether they addressed issues or gaps or identified in previous research, make sure they harmonise with existing state guidance to the greatest amount we could there, developing guidance with that addresses the major risk as well. So guide 1 was a planning, design and construction measures which pertain to the establishment of new farms, and then, as I said, guide 2 was around environmental management measures to be employed to reduce the risk of impacts of new and existing farms. Probably the main resolution that came out of that technical reference group was, we needed to change the guidelines. So they need to be more audience focused. So the decision was made to come up with new guidelines. So not one essentially around the assessment process, the design and construction versus the management. Now it's write a guideline for your audience. So a separate guideline for planners. So this is what a planner needs to follow when they see a new application, and then write a separate guideline for applicants. So basically telling industry, this is the information that you need to include in a document to be presented. So we'll come up with 2 guides. So a planning and environmental management guidelines for establishing meat chicken farms. One's an assessment guide and one's an applicant's guide. So the assessment guideline, that's just an example of the table of contents of the document that we've set out for consultation recently. And it obviously, when you're dealing with planners and so forth, they might not actually know, what a meat chicken farm is and how the structure of the industry works and how it typically is. So there's a bit of information in there. It's importantly got a chapter that come out of there on strategic planning stuff. So yes, this is sort of high level planning, and you might think, well, why are we putting that in a national guideline? Well, essentially what happens at the local government level is that, every 5 or 10 years, they update their local planning schemes at the local government level, and they really go searching for this sort of information, and it's pretty important that you get that up front to them. So this information exists on, where the industry going, how big it is, the sort of things that farms need access to if you're going to set up an industry or continue with an industry in a particular area. So I saw that as fairly important information. And then obviously things around location and design, management of the farm, and then we've got some more technical appendix in there, like assessing odour impacts, surface and groundwater risk assessment tool in there, sizing compost areas, and designing vegetative filter areas. So some more of those technical components put in appendices. The applicant's guide, so it's written for the audience as for applicants to do. So it's got an important chapter on the things you need to do before you even begin the process. It's got some of the approvals process that are in each state. What are the application requirements that you need to put in there? Discusses the stages of approval process. Even though each state's different, they really overarching stuff is pretty similar. So we put that information in there for producers and stuff as well. So then that applicant's guide. I won't go into those in too much more detail. I'll probably just go and touch on where the project's at. So the 3 guidelines, we widely circulated them. So yes, we had an Odour working group. We had this technical reference group, but all the idea of the guidelines was always to send them out to a wider stakeholder group for consultation. We sent them out on the 1st of September. Most of the comments come back by the end of October. We've got a few still trickling in now. So that's on the guidelines. The planning and environmental one for meat chicken farms, the assessment guide. We had 640 odd comments on it. The applicants one 460, and on the best practice Odour one 170. You think, that's a lot of comments. We really got it wrong, but from developing guidelines before, that's probably fairly typical and not that bad. We're sending this out to a pretty wide audience, and people are going to have different views. So really at the process, that's what we're doing now. We're basically working through those comments and addressing them, and really trying to find out from that feedback, collating that feedback. A lot of them can be minor comments, that you got to deal with, but we want to see if there's any showstoppers in there really, and things that we need to go back and talk to AgriFutures about. about whether we can address those. So that's meant to happen at the end of this month. So that's our next milestone, to go and talk to AgriFutures about that, provide them with that collated feedback, and have a discussion with them about where to from here with it. And our plan is then to have some final draft. And that was probably it. That was all I was going to say. So I just got my contact details. And obviously, yeah, get a copy of the guidelines and stuff when they're finished. You can get a hold of us there.